All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murachs, JavaScript, and jQuery 3rd edition as part of the AWD, Application and Web Development 1000 Web Technologies class. We're up to Chapter 9 of 18, which is on how to use effects and animations. As you can see here, we have one applied objective and 6 knowledge objectives. Our applied objective: use jQuery to add effects and animations to a web page. Our knowledge objectives: describe the use of the jQuery methods for effects, describe how to start and stop a slideshow using an interval timer, describe how the jQuery animate method works in general terms, explain how the chaining of methods for the animate method works and how callback functions work for these. Describe the use of delay, stop, and finish methods within effects and animations. And finally, describe the use of easings with effects and animations. Now, the basic methods to create jQuery effects are shown here. All right, show will display something, typically from the upper left to the lower right. Hide will hide it, typically from the lower right to the upper left. Toggle will either display or hide, so if it's showing, it'll make it invisible. If it's invisible, it'll show it. Slide down will display elements with a sliding motion. Slide up will hide elements with a sliding motion. Slide toggle will go back and forth between slide up and slide down. Fade in will display selected elements by fading them in to opaque. Fade out will take these opaque elements and fade them out to transparent. Fade toggle will go back and forth between fade in and fade out. And fade to can be used to adjust the opacity property of the selected elements. Now, when you work with virtually all of this stuff, as you see here, you can have a duration parameter, and you've got your choice. You can put slow or fast in there, or you can put in a number that's shown by milliseconds. So, if you put 1,000, it would do that over 1 second, for example. There's also a callback shown there. The callback parameter is for a function that will be called after the effect is finished. If more than one element is selected, the callback is run once for each of these elements. All right. Now, typically when you use this too, you're going to end up using chaining for effects. And this works because each effect method returns the object that it performed the effect on. So here they show, for example, the basic syntax for the fade to method, and a bunch of other examples. Now, what they do in here is they go through, again, the jQuery. They go through the application for an FAQ. All right? And the idea is the application in the last chapter used the show and hide without duration parameters. Now in this example, they'll show 2 ways that you can apply animation. All right. In the first example that they show here, it's similar to the code we saw in the previous chapter. When the user clicks on an H2 element, the function for the click event uses the toggle class to either add or remove the class name minus. All right. And here's another example where rather than using fade out with a slide down, we use the slide toggle. You get the same results. All right. So often, good, bad, or indifferent, when you are working with jQuery, there are multiple ways of doing the same thing. And it's not so much that any one is better than any other ways, there's just ways of doing it. All right? So again, in this chapter, we're talking about how to create special effects, oftentimes by using animation, where we're moving something up and down, left or right, making it appear, disappear, etc. And callback functions, which are functions that you can have, that you can call after something has taken place. All right. Next, they do the slideshow application, and what they do is they have the images for that are in the slideshow will basically fade in and fade out. Now, when you start going through this stuff, there's really two ways that you can code your jQuery. And it should be obvious that most jQuery applications can be coded in many different ways. To many people, the biggest problem with even learning jQuery is to figure out how to get the result you want. Well, I always tell students this. It's like if I was, the campus that I teach at is in Wentzville, Missouri. And it is about 40 miles west of the St. Louis campus. And if I told the students that we were going to meet at the St. Louis campus to watch a demonstration or whatever, I wouldn't tell the students how to get there. I would just ask if they know how to get there. And if they said they did, I'd figure that they could get there, and how they did it was up to them. Well, in much the same way, the book here will frequently show more than one way to get a result, but it's up to you to decide which of those ways make the most sense to you. All right? Now, in this example that you see on the screen right now, the code starts by creating an array of image objects that stores the source and alt attributes of the 5 image or slides that we're going to have in here. After the array has been created, we'll use this set interval function that you see down on the bottom here, okay, to perform whatever you want to perform every 3,000 milliseconds. So every 3 seconds, make this fade in, fade out, or whatever. And we'll have a callback function in here, and that's what's shown here. And the first statement there sets a new value for the image counter, which was initially set to 0. Once it's set, all right, hopefully most of the rest of the stuff there is fairly seamless. The next image variable is set to the next image in the array. The source attribute is set accordingly, and the text for the caption is set accordingly. All right. Now, another way you can do the same thing is shown, and this is all on page 269 in the book. This code starts by setting the next slide variable to the first image in the slides div. Then the function for the set interval timer fades out the starting slide and caption, just as it did in the first example. However, the code in the callback for the fade out is completely different. It starts by testing whether the next element in the slides div has a length of 0. If it does, it means there is no more slides. Otherwise, the next slide is set to the next image in the slides div. Once the next slide has been established, the code sets variables for the next slide source and attributes. Then it uses the first variable to set the source for the image that it's displaying, and it fades it in. These are just 2 ways of doing it, but there are plenty of ways, regardless of the way that you do this. So regardless of the method that you use, what's important is that you get the correct result. Now on page 271, they show the jQuery for starting and for stopping a slideshow. All right. So as they mentioned, to improve the usability, you may want to allow the user to click a button or do something else to stop on a slide if the user clicks on the slide, and restart it when they click on it again. So in the example here, first the code sets up a function expression for running the slideshow, and it stores it in a variable named run slideshow. If you look at the code, hopefully you can see it's pretty much the same as the code in the second example that we previously talked about. This function is followed by a statement that creates a timer variable that calls for the slideshow to run every 3 seconds. The last event handler uses the click event method to cancel and restore the timer on alternate clicks. This slideshow stops on a full image, not one that's fading in or fading out, and that's because the timer for the slideshow isn't canceled until the current event ends. So again, with this code, the user can stop a slideshow by clicking on a slide and restart it by clicking on it again. So we don't have to repeat this code. It's coded in a function expression and stored in the variable run slideshow. So it must come before the set interval method that calls it, otherwise the JavaScript engine will throw an error. Let's talk a little bit about animation. When the animate method is run, the CSS properties for the selected elements are changed to the properties in what's called the properties map that is coded as the first parameter of the method. The animation is done in a phased transition based on the duration parameter that you see right here. To specify a property name in the properties map, you use camel casing rather than the CSS using hyphenation. All right. So here we've got font size, but if we were using that in JavaScript code, it would have to be font size run together with a capital S and no minus sign in there. To specify a non-numeric property, you enclose the value within quotes, typically double quotes. To specify a numeric value, you just code it. For some properties like width, height, and opacity, you can use show, hide, and toggle. Now, color transitions in here are not handled directly by jQuery, but they are handled by the jQuery UI, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. You can chain animation methods using the same technique that we use for chaining other effects or methods. You code the dot operator after the first animate method, then the second animate method. All right, and did they show it here? This dot animate. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. When you chain the effects and animations for an element, they're placed in a queue for that element and run in sequence. In other words, not at the same time. When separate effects and animations are started for an element, they're also placed in a queue for that element and run in sequence. When you use a callback function with an animate method, the callback is run after the animation is finished. In some cases, a problem may occur if you start a second animation before the first one has finished. And that's why you may end up using some of the methods that are shown here, such as the delay, stop, and finish methods. Now the delay method, as it says there, it delays the start of the next animation in the queue. Typically you want to delay it until the animation that's currently running finishes. Stop stops the current animation. Finish will stop the current animation for the selected element, clear the queue, and complete all animations for the selected element. So the delay works as an alternative to the use of a one-time timer. The stop stops the current animation and clears the queue. Typically this will stop, for example, you might have a bouncing effect that occurs when you move right back and forth between different things. For example, if you were working on that thumbnail example that we looked at earlier. And the finish method is similar to stop, except that the properties of all queued animations jump to their end values. Now another thing is when you use this stuff, all right, when you start to use this stuff, they talk, starting on page 278, on how to use easings, all right, with effects and animations. Now easing means that's the way an animation is performed. Currently, jQuery provides two easings, swing, which is the default, and it's the animation you usually want, and linear. Now, there are plugins that provide for other types of easings. And some of the examples are going to be shown, I think, in here. To use an easing, you code a script element for the plugin library, then you code the easing parameter for a method with the name of any easing that the plugin supports. And if you go in here, do they show it? No, they don't. But the author says that for a full list and demonstration of all the easings, let's go out to that website and take a look and see what that shows. I'm doing fine for time. All right, so I'm going to go out. This is shown on page 279 in the book, http://gsgd.co.uk, so it's English, sandbox, jQuery, easing. All right, so here are examples of how you can, okay, and I'm sure there are other ones also. So you can really see how you can play around with the effect here. Now, believe it or not, this is most of the stuff that you need in order to perform effects and animations. But if you're trying to build something that has more control, what's shown here, some of the options for the advanced syntax are shown here. All right, and some code. This first example shows how to work with duration, special, easing, and complete. I'm not going to go through it. It's fairly complex. The special easing option of the animate method lets you specify easings by property, and that's what's shown here. But you can also do it with a basic syntax as is shown right here. The name parameter in the methods for working with cues isn't needed for the default cue. It's only needed for any custom cues that you create. All right. Finally, the chapter ends by talking about this carousel application. The idea is this is kind of a slideshow, and when you click here, this one moves, this one moves, this one moves off the screen, and a new one can slide in here when you click here. When you click here, this moves over to here, this moves over to here, this moves off the screen, and a new one should move in here. All right. So the carousel is a common application. It makes use of a simple animate method, but the setup for it is fairly extensive. So what's shown here is the user interface, the HTML, that's the interface, there's the HTML, there's the CSS, and because carousels are so common, you probably have used one before. Now in the HTML that's here, there are 3 div elements coded within a div element for the entire carousel. The first contains the left button, the second contains all 9 books that are used in the carousel, and the third has the right button. Within the second div, you can see a UL that contains the 9 LI elements. Here's the critical CSS, and you'll notice there isn't too much of it. Not only that, as it says, some of this stuff that's here is required, or this is required for Internet Explorer. The magic, so to speak, in here is the jQuery that is shown in the book on page 285. The jQuery consists of 2 event handlers, one for the right button, one for the left button. The last line in each event handler uses the animate method to change the left property of the slider to the value of a variable named new left property. All right. The trick is setting the value of this new left property each time the right or left button is clicked. And that's what's being done in the code that you see here. And that is pretty much it for this chapter. I want to go through one more today if I have time, and that is Chapter 10, to talk about forms and data validation. So I'll be back with that presentation shortly.